The boxes were already stacked by the time James Calloway reached the loading dock that Thursday evening. He had come down the back stairwell for the first time in 3 years. His assistant had taken the elevator key by mistake, and he had a car waiting, and so he saw it by accident. The kind of accident that changes everything. Helen Marsh, the cleaner assigned to floors 14 through 18, stood at the edge of the dock in her gray uniform, both arms wrapped around a tower of flattened cardboard boxes, her chin resting on top of the stack to keep it balanced. She did not see him. She turned and walked toward the service exit, the boxes shifting with each step, and pushed her way through the door with her shoulder. James Calloway stood still for a moment. He was the kind of man who noticed things. 41 years in business had trained him to see what others overlooked, which was why Calloway Group had become the third largest property development company in the country, which was why his name was on 3 buildings within a mile of where he was standing. He had never been wrong about a person in his professional life. He prided himself on that. He was wrong about what he felt watching her go. He told himself it was curiosity. It was not. It turned and took the stairwell back up to his office, and he told himself he had imagined it, and he got in his car when it arrived. Anna went home to the penthouse apartment on the 28th floor, and he sat in a room that still smelled faintly of the perfume his wife had worn, and he did not sleep. That was not the first box Helen Marsh had taken, not by a long way. The building's operations manager, Gareth Fowler, had been watching the same footage for 3 weeks before he brought it to James's desk on a Monday morning with his hands folded and his voice arranged into something that resembled genuine concern. The security logs were printed and clipped to a manila folder. The timestamps were circled in red ink. Every shift, Gareth said, setting the folder down with the careful precision of a man laying a trap and calling it a gift. We've cross-referenced the inventory. The cardboard from the loading dock, boxes that should be flattened and collected by the recycling contractor. They're going missing on her shifts specifically. It started 8 months ago. I've been monitoring it quietly because I wanted to be certain before I brought it to you. James looked at the photographs. Helen Marsh, photographed from above by the loading dock camera, carrying boxes toward the service exit. The timestamps matched the log. The pattern was consistent, undeniable, a straight line drawn through 8 months of Thursday and Friday evenings. What else is she taking? James asked. Gareth paused just long enough. We're still looking into that. James Calloway was not a cruel man. His wife Catherine had told him that once in the last good year they had together, when he had let a long-serving driver go with a year's salary and a letter of recommendation rather than the severance minimum his legal team had suggested. She had said it quietly, the way she said things that mattered, looking up at him from across the kitchen table. You are not a cruel man, James. Don't let grief make you one. He had been thinking about that sentence for 2 years. He had not always succeeded. Helen Marsh had worked on floors 14 through 18 for 6 years. She was 44 years old. She arrived 11 minutes early every morning and left 12 minutes after her shift ended. In 6 years, she had taken 4 days of sick leave. She had never complained about a reassignment, never asked for a schedule change, never raised her voice in the direction of anyone who outranked her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Doris Aguilar, had noted in her last 3 annual reviews that Helen was the most reliable member of the cleaning staff, and that the residents on her floors had submitted complimentary notes on 3 separate occasions. None of this stopped James from calling the meeting. He had wanted to speak with her privately. He did not get that choice. Gareth had arranged it differently. The operations team assembled in the main lobby for what he had told them was a routine security update, and he had brought Helen in through the front entrance rather than the service corridor. And so when the accusation was made, there were 14 people standing in a marble lobby with the morning light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows and nowhere to look except at each other. We have footage, Gareth said, standing to the left of James with the folder open in his hands. Consistent removal of company property over a period of 8 months. I am required to inform you, Helen, that this constitutes grounds for immediate termination pending a formal review. Helen Marsh stood very straight. She was not a tall woman. She wore her uniform with the careful neatness of someone who understood that presentation was a form of dignity. The collar smooth, the badge aligned. Her hair was pinned back from her face, and she stood with her hands at her sides, rather than clasped in front of her, which was what James noticed. That she had not assumed the posture of someone waiting to be punished. She was simply standing in a room. She looked at the folder in Garrett's hands. Then she looked at James. "May I see the footage?" she asked. Her voice was even. Not cold, even. The way a river is even when you cannot see the bottom. "The footage has been reviewed by the operations team," Garrett said. "It's quite clear." "I'm sure it is," Helen said. She looked at James again. "Mr. Calloway, I have worked in this building for 6 years. In 6 years, I have not taken anything from this building that was not given to me or would otherwise have been destroyed. The boxes go to recycling," Gareth said. "They are company property until they are collected." "I understand," Helen said. She did not say anything else for a moment. The lobby was very quiet. The security guard near the revolving door was looking at the floor. Doris Aguilar stood near the reception desk with her hands folded in front of her and her eyes very still, watching the way a person watches a fire from a distance, knowing they are too far away to stop it. James cleared his throat. "Helen, I think it would be best if—" "You can take my job, Mr. Calloway." Her voice had not risen. If anything, it was quieter than before, the way the air goes quiet before a storm changes direction. She looked at him directly, and not at the folder, and not at Gareth, and not at the 14 people standing behind her. "You cannot take what I built with those boxes. That belongs to them. And it will still be standing long after I've gone." The lobby was silent. Then Gareth said, "Security will escort you to collect your belongings." And Helen Marsh nodded once and turned and walked toward the service corridor without being asked. And she did not look back. And that was the thing James Calloway could not stop thinking about afterward. That she did not look back. He did not go back to his office that morning. He sat in his car in the underground parking structure for 22 minutes with the engine off. The folder was on the passenger seat. He looked at the photographs of Helen Marsh and her cardboard boxes, and he looked at his own hands on the steering wheel, and he thought about his wife's voice, the specific way she had said his name in the last year of her life, when she was asking him to pay attention to something he was about to miss. He started the engine. He did not go home. What he did instead, he would not have been able to explain cleanly to anyone who asked him. He told himself it was due diligence. He told himself he simply wanted to understand, not to accuse her further, not to involve the police, not yet. He needed to understand what she had meant. What belongs to them? Who was them? What was still standing? He drove to the service exit on Carrick Lane, and he sat in his car across the street. And he waited. Helen Marsh came out of the building at 7:14 in the evening. She was no longer in uniform. She wore a dark coat and carried a canvas bag over her shoulder, and she walked in the direction of the bus stop at the end of the lane without looking around. She did not cry. He had half expected her to be crying. He had seen grown men cry after being dismissed in front of colleagues, men with far more pride and far less reason. But she walked the way she had stood in the lobby, straight, even, moving forward. He followed at a distance. The bus took her east, away from the financial district, away from the glass towers and the wide pavements and the coffee shops that charged £8 for something with a foreign name. The streets changed in the way streets change when no one is paying attention to them. Gradually, and then all at once. The buildings got shorter. The signage got older. The people at the bus stops wore heavier coats and stood closer together against the November wind. Ellen got off at a stop James did not recognize. He pulled over 200 yards back and watched her walk. She turned left onto a street that his GPS identified only as Otter Road, and then left again onto something the GPS had no name for at all. A lane, really, unpaved past the first 20 feet, leaned on both sides by houses that had been built to last and had lasted longer than anyone had intended. Gardens, gone to thistles, gutters hanging, the specific exhaustion of buildings that had been holding themselves together through sheer stubbornness for years. The kind of streets where every cracked window and peeling door tells a story of money that ran out before the problem did. He got out of his car. He walked. He was wearing the wrong shoes. He noticed it when the pavement gave way to packed dirt and his leather soles slipped slightly on the uneven ground. His coat was the wrong coat too, navy wool, the kind that said office building and boardroom, and 14 floors of polished marble. He felt it as he walked, the way the street looked at him without looking at him, the way the space itself registered the wrongness of his presence. He had not been in a street like this since he was 23 years old and hungry and renting a room above a chip shop in Gateshead. And that had been so long ago that remembering it felt like remembering someone else's life. Helen stopped in front of a house two-thirds of the way down the lane. It was not the worst house on the street, but it was not far from it. The front gate had been repaired recently with wire. He could see the new wire bright against the older metal, and the path from gate to door was swept clean despite the dirt around it. The windows were intact. That was notable. In a row of houses where every second building had at least one cracked or boarded window, this one had intact glass in all four visible panes. And behind the glass on the ground floor, there was a light on. She did not go in immediately. She stopped at the gate and reached into her canvas bag, and he saw her shoulders change, the straightness she had carried all day softening, just slightly, like a key fitting into the lock it was made for. She was home. Or whatever this place was to her, she was somewhere she could put down the weight. It crossed the street quietly. He did not follow her through the gate. Instead, he moved to the side of the house, where the lane narrowed into a passageway between properties. And there was a gap in the wooden fence. One board sprung loose at the top, leaning outward, and through that gap, at an angle, he could see the side window of the ground floor room. It told himself he would stay 1 minute. He heard it before he saw anything. A child's voice, high and warm and entirely unsuspecting. "Mom, you're home." Not a question, a statement of relief, the kind of relief that only exists when the alternative has been considered. He pressed himself against the fence and looked through the gap. The room was small and lit by a single overhead bulb and a lamp on a low table, and it was the warmest room he had seen in years. That was the first thing that struck him. Not its poverty, not the bare walls or the mismatched furniture or the curtains that were not quite the right size for the windows, but its warmth. The way it had been made into something. The way every object in it had been placed with the specific care of someone who could not afford to waste anything but understood that beauty was not about cost. There was a boy of perhaps 11 sitting at a table with a schoolbook open in front of him. A girl younger than that, 7 or 8, asleep on a sofa that had been positioned near the lamp, and a smaller girl, 5 or 6, who had run to Helen at the door and was now being lifted and held against Helen's shoulder, her small arms around Helen's neck. "Was it a bad day?" the boy asked. He was watching his mother over the top of his book with the careful watchfulness of a child who has learned to read adults. "It was a long day," Helen said. She set the small girl down and knelt to take off her coat. "Have you eaten? Did Oliver make the soup?" "I made the soup," the boy said, with the particular dignity of an 11-year-old who has done something practical and well. "Emma ate 2 bowls." "Good," Helen said. "Good boy." She crossed the room to the sleeping girl and touched her forehead with the back of her hand. Checking for fever, James realized. The way you check for fever when checking for fever is a habit born of necessity rather than caution. The girl stirred and did not wake. "Sophie's chest was bad this morning." The boy, Oliver, said quietly. Helen nodded. She was already moving to the canvas bag, pulling out a box, a small white box pharmaceutical, the kind that comes from a chemist, and setting it on the table beside the lamp. She had bought medicine. She had bought medicine on the day she was fired. "She'll be better tomorrow," Helen said. Oliver looked at his mother for a long moment. Then he said, in the voice of a boy practicing something he had heard adults say and not yet fully understood, "Will you be okay, Mom?" Helen Marsh looked at her son. She smiled, and it was a real smile, not the arranged kind, the kind that costs something to produce. "We'll be fine," she said. "Dad would have known what to do," Oliver said. He said it carefully, the way children say things about the dead, not to wound but because they are still learning where the words land. Ellen sat down beside him at the table. She put her hand over his on the schoolbook. "Your dad knew what to do about most things," she said. "Mr. Calloway's company," Oliver said. Not a question, not an accusation either exactly. Simply the shape of a fact that he had been carrying and had decided to put down for a moment. "Is that where you still work?" The silence that followed lasted only 4 seconds. It felt like a year. "Yes," Helen said. "Dad said Mr. Calloway was a good man," Oliver said. "He said that the day before." It did not say the day before what. He did not need to. James Calloway stepped back from the fence. He did not remember walking back to the car. It was simply at the car, and then he was inside it, and his hands were on the steering wheel, and he could not make himself start the engine. The cold had settled into the car while he was standing in the lane, and his breath clouded in front of him, but he did not feel the cold. It felt instead a kind of silence inside himself that was different from the silence he had lived in since Catherine died. That silence had been the silence of absence, of rooms without sound, of mornings with nothing in them. This silence was the silence of something arriving. Daniel Marsh. He knew the name. He had not known he knew it until Oliver said your dad and the two things connected. The Marsh in her personnel file, the Marsh on the incident report from 3 years ago, the worksite on the Ellerton development, the scaffolding failure that the health and safety inquiry had attributed to a subcontractor's negligence and had resulted in a £200,000 fine and a restructured safety protocol, and one man who had gone to work on a Tuesday morning and had not come home. Daniel Marsh, age 41, survived by his wife Helen and 3 children. James sat in the car for a long time. He did not cry. He had not cried since Catherine's funeral, when he had stood at the graveside and felt the sky pressing down on him, and understood for the first time that certain weights are permanent. But his hands shook on the steering wheel, not from the cold, and when he finally turned the key in the ignition, he had to try twice because his hands would not cooperate. Anne drove home very slowly through streets that looked different than they had an hour ago, as though the city had rearranged itself while he was standing at a gap in a fence, listening to a boy talk about his dead father. That was the night James Calloway understood what Helen Marsh had been carrying out of his building every single Thursday and Friday evening for 8 months. Not company property, not stolen goods. Cardboard, flattened cardboard boxes that would have been baled and collected and turned into something else anyway. Boxes that cost the Calloway Group nothing and had cost Helen Marsh everything. Because she had been using them, he understood now with a certainty that sat in his chest like something heavy and permanent to build furniture. For Oliver and Emma and Sophie, in a house that had been emptied of the things Daniel Marsh's wages had paid for, piece by piece, over the 3 years since his death. He had seen the shelving unit against the wall in the lamplight. He had looked at it and registered it as furniture and moved on. He looked at it again in his memory now and recognized the edges. The specific corrugation pattern, the way it had been layered and sealed and braced with wooden dowels to make something that held weight. He had walked past 100 cardboard structures in his years in construction, temporary shelving and display units and packing fixtures. He knew what reinforced cardboard looked like when it was built with care. She had been building them a home, with boxes that no one wanted. With the hours she had after the children were asleep, she had been building them a home. A was in his office at 7 o'clock the following morning. A had not called ahead. He had not told his assistant. He had driven to the building himself and sat at his desk and opened the files from Gareth Fowler's investigation. Not just the folder Gareth had presented, but all of it. Everything in the operation system, the inventory logs, and the access records, and the security reports. Anne had read them with the specific attention he brought to contracts that needed to be understood completely before they were signed. By 9 o'clock, he understood what Gareth Fowler had been doing. The inventory discrepancies were real, but they were not limited to cardboard from the loading dock. They ran through the supply chain in a pattern that was easy to miss if you were looking at one category at a time and very obvious if you looked at all of them together. Cleaning products, small appliances, building materials from the renovation storage on floors 3 and 4, items that could be sold easily and quickly, and in small enough quantities not to attract immediate attention. The trail was methodical and long, and it led, very clearly, to a supplier account that Gareth Fowler had opened himself under a business name that was 2 letters different from a legitimate contractor the Calloway Group had used for years. Helen Marsh had been taking cardboard boxes. Gareth Fowler had been taking £63,000 worth of company property over 22 months. He had used her pattern as cover. It had flagged her to James precisely because an active investigation into her gave him time and justification and a scapegoat, and because she was the kind of person whose word would not automatically be weighed against his. It was wrong about that. He had not counted on James Calloway, standing in a lane in the dark listening through a gap in a fence, because no one would have counted on that. James called the company's legal team at 9:15. He called building security at 9:40. He sent a single message to his assistant that said, "Ask Doris Aguilar to come to my office and then ask her to call Helen Marsh." He held a staff meeting in the lobby. He held it in the lobby because Gareth Fowler had chosen the lobby for a reason, and James Calloway understood that justice required the same audience that injustice had. The 14 members of the operations and cleaning team who had stood in that marble space 2 days ago and watched Helen Marsh be accused were standing in the same marble space now. And Doris Aguilar was there, and the security team was there, and Gareth Fowler was there because he had not yet understood what was happening. James had thought carefully about what he wanted to say. He had written 4 versions of it the previous night. He used none of them. 3 days ago, he said, I stood in this lobby and allowed an accusation to be made against a member of our staff on the basis of evidence I had not fully examined. He should have examined it first. I did not, and that failure of judgment is mine. He paused. The evidence has now been examined fully. Helen Marsh took nothing from this building that was not hers by right of the work she did here. The investigation into supply chain irregularities has identified a different source. He looked at Gareth Fowler. Mr. Fowler, building security will accompany you to your office to collect your personal belongings. You will have no further access to Callaway Group systems or premises. Our legal team will be in contact. Gareth Fowler said something James did not register it. He was watching Doris Aguilar, who was standing near the reception desk in the same place she had stood 2 days ago, and who was looking at the floor with an expression of such visible, exhausted relief that it seemed like a physical thing, like something she had been carrying in her hands for a very long time, and had just been allowed to sit down. Helen Marsh arrived at 11:30. She did not know why she had been called. Doris had not told her. She came in through the front entrance in her dark coat, the canvas bag on her shoulder, and she stopped just inside the door and looked at James standing near the center of the lobby, and the 14 members of staff still present, and Doris Aguilar and the security guard who was not looking at the floor this time, but at her. James walked toward her. Mrs. Marsh, he said. He stopped a few feet in front of her. He had thought about what he was going to say here too. He had written nothing down. I owe you an apology. A full one, publicly, in the same place where I failed you. Helen Marsh looked at him. Her expression was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a person who is receiving something they needed and had stopped expecting. I know who you are, James said. I know about Daniel. I should have known years ago. I did not, and I am sorry for that too. A very small sound came from somewhere in Helen Marsh's chest. She pressed her lips together. She did not cry. She simply stood very straight in the marble lobby and nodded. Once. The way she had nodded 2 days ago when security had offered to escort her out. With the absolute control of a person who has learned that composure is not the absence of feeling, but its most powerful expression. I would like to offer you your position back, James said. That is the minimum. That is not all I am offering. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. There is a contract in here for a newly created role, Director of Employee Welfare, Callaway Group. It is a salaried position at the executive level. It comes with full benefits for your family. The role exists because it should have existed before Daniel died, and because if it had, there are men who would still be alive. I would like you to help me build it. Helen looked at the envelope. There is something else, James said. I want to establish a foundation. Formally, legally, with proper funding. The Daniel Marsh Memorial Safety Foundation. Independent workplace safety inspections at construction and development sites, with a particular focus on subcontractor compliance. And a scholarship program for the children of workers in the construction industry, named after Daniel, for Oliver and Emma and Sophie, and for every family that has been where yours has been. The lobby was completely silent. You can take time to consider it, James said. I don't need time, Helen said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the specific brightness that comes from holding something that has both weight and value. Then yes, she said, to all of it. That evening, James Calloway drove to the lane that his GPS had no name for, and he knocked on the gate rather than standing in the passageway, and Oliver answered and looked up at him with the careful watchfulness of a boy who had learned to assess adults before trusting them. And then he heard his mother's voice from inside the house and stood back to let James in. They sat around the kitchen table, all five of them. Emma had recovered from her fever and sat next to Helen with her elbow touching her mother's arm in the way small children anchor themselves to the people they love. Sophie fell asleep before the meal was finished, curled in the armchair near the lamp, as though she had been placed there by someone who knew exactly how she needed to be held. Oliver asked James 3 questions about construction and one about whether he had ever met anyone famous, and James answered all four with equal seriousness. On the shelf against the wall, the cardboard shelf, layered and sealed and built with the care of someone who understood that what you build with your hands is a kind of prayer for the people you build it for. There was a candle, a white candle in a glass holder. At some point during the meal, without any of them noticing when, the flame moved, not from a drought. The windows were closed and the door was closed and the night was still outside. The flame moved the way flames move in old stories and old houses, when something that has been held apart is brought together. A small, brief, entirely certain gesture, the kind that asks nothing of you, except that you notice it. James noticed it. He thought about Daniel Marsh, age 41, who had gone to work on a Tuesday morning on a site that James Calloway had permitted to operate below standard, and who had told his son the day before he died that the man who owned the company was a good man. Ed did not know what he had done to deserve that. He intended to spend the rest of his professional life trying to be worth it. Doris Aguilar told the story to her sister 3 weeks later, sitting at her own kitchen table, and her sister said, "What is it about, really?" And Doris thought for a moment and said, "It's about what a person carries, and who they carry it for, and whether the people who should have been paying attention finally do." That is as close to the truth as language can get. There is a kind of labor that no timesheet records and no performance review captures, the labor of carrying dignity through a world that has given you every reason to put it down. If you have ever walked out of a place that did not see you clearly, if you ever stood straight in a room that was trying to make you small, if you have ever built something beautiful out of material no one else wanted, then you know what Helen Marsh knew, which is that what you take from a place is never the thing they can see. It is everything you refuse to surrender, and that will be standing long after the building itself is gone.